The noonday sun baked the dust-packed ground until it shimmered like glass. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and merciless, a hard blue without shade or mercy. In the center of the square stood the gallows, two beams of rough pine, rope swaying like a vulture's shadow in the heat. The people gathered, boots grinding the dirt, whispers clinging to the air as if the whole town had been waiting for this spectacle. And presiding over it all was the judge. His black coat seemed to drink in the sunlight, his eyes steady, unflinching as he looked over the crowd. Some said he was carved from iron, others that he was a man hollowed by power. But on this day, one thing was undeniable. He was smiling. The condemned stood at the center, a young woman with her wrists bound, her hair disheveled, her face pale with terror. Her dress, plain, dark, respectable, was twisted by the dust of the walk to the gallows. The crowd muttered her name like a curse and a prayer. She was his daughter, the judge's blood, the very girl who had once sat on his knee in church pews, now branded traitor, liar, and worse by the town's gossip. The hangman adjusted the knot. The rope creaked as though eager for its work. Somewhere in the crowd a child whimpered, and from the back, leaning on the worn stock of his rifle, the rancher watched with narrowed eyes. He had not come to watch justice. He had come because he had heard the whispers, same as the rest. That she'd been caught in a scandal too deep to crawl out of. That she had betrayed her kin. That her father, the judge himself, had cast the first stone. The rancher didn't trust rumor. He trusted the look in a person's eyes, and in that moment, when her gaze swept across the sea of hostile faces, it caught on his, wide, terrified, silent, but pleading. A plea that cut sharper than the desert wind. The hangman's hand rested on the lever. The judge gave the faintest nod, lips curling in satisfaction. The crowd swelled with restless sound like a storm about to break. And just before the rope tightened, time seemed to slow. The dust hung still, and the rancher realized this wasn't justice. This was a sacrifice. The image freezes in the mind like a photograph scorched into memory. The judge smiling at his people, his daughter trembling on the trapdoor, and the noose waiting to snap. The narrator's voice settles low, steady. That's where it began. A father's smile, a daughter's plea, and a rope that promised to end more than one life. But out here on the frontier, nothing ends so clean. Nothing hangs so simple. The plains swallowed the night in silence, except for the pounding of hooves tearing across the dry earth. The rancher's coat snapped in the wind as he rode hard. The judge's daughter slumped against his chest, her wrists raw from rope. Behind them, the echo of shouts and lanterns still burned in his memory, an entire crowd baying for blood, satisfied to watch the judge smile while his own kin swung. By the time he reached the cabin, dawn's first ash-gray light crept along the horizon. The place was no fortress, just weathered timber, crooked shingles, and windows patched with rags. Yet it stood alone, ringed by brittle grass that whispered like voices in the wind. He shoved the door open with his shoulder, guided her inside, and dropped the bar across the frame. The hollow thud of the wood closing echoed louder than a gunshot. A single lantern threw weak light into the corners. The walls breathed drafts, groaning as if they shared in the secret. She stood rigid, bonnet half torn, eyes darting like a trapped animal. He poured water into a tin cup, slid it across the table, but she didn't touch it. "You aim to keep me alive," she said finally, voice hoarse, "or just long enough to trade me back." The rancher leaned against the wall, arms folded. His silence hung heavier than words. "Your father wanted the crowd to cheer," he said at last. "They didn't care if you were guilty. Didn't even want proof. That's why I pulled you down." Her hands trembled as she brought the cup to her lips. Dirt streaked her face where tears had carved lines through dust. She drank, but her eyes never left his. "And how do I know you ain't lying?" she whispered. He gave a dry laugh without humor. "You don't. Trust don't come cheap out here. Not for me. Not for you." The cabin creaked as the wind pressed against the boards. Both of them turned toward the sound, hearts jumping at nothing more than prairie air. Every shadow outside could be a rider, every scrape a boot. Inside that fragile wooden box, mistrust hung thicker than the smoke curling from the lantern. They were two strangers bound by a secret neither fully believed, and the night had only just begun. The fire was small, barely more than a circle of orange sparks gnawing at scraps of cedar. Its glow trembled against the log walls of the cabin, tracing shadows across two weathered faces. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and black, whispering with the restless sound of night wind. Inside, silence pressed just as hard. The widow sat close to the flames, her wrists raw where the ropes had rubbed her skin. Her dress was torn at the seams, dust clinging to the folds. She cradled a tin cup in both hands, though the water inside had long since cooled. Across from her, the rancher leaned on one knee, silent, face half buried in the shadow of his hat. The fire caught his eyes now and then, showing the tired steel in them, the kind of gaze born from too many burials. Finally, she spoke, her voice thin but edged with a spark that hadn't died. He said it was justice. That's what my father called it. Justice. He smiled at the crowd while he tied the noose himself. Her words hung heavy, smoke curling between them. The rancher didn't answer, not at first. He had heard too many stories of lawmen twisting the word justice until it snapped clean in half. He only raised his chin slightly, waiting. The widow's eyes flared, wet but burning. You think I'm guilty, don't you? You think I belong on that rope. But I never stole what they said I stole. Never betrayed who they claimed I betrayed. My father needed someone to blame. Someone close enough to silence the whispers about him. And his daughter, her voice cracked into a bitter laugh. His daughter was cheap enough to spend. The rancher's jaw flexed, but he kept still. Then, after a long pause, he let the words come, slow and steady, like iron dragging across stone. You ain't the first to be sold out by blood. Lawman cut down my brother for less than a whisper. Said he drew first, but the smoke was still in their pistols when they swore it. I buried him in red earth before I even knew who gave the order. Later I found the judge's name written on the warrants. Same hand that tied your rope wrote my family's death warrant. The widow's breath caught, eyes searching his face as though to measure truth. For the first time since the fire started, her anger gave way to something else. Recognition. The rancher pulled a leather pouch from his coat. Inside, folded and worn thin, was a page torn from a ledger. He tossed it onto the dirt floor between them. The firelight showed black ink, neat and cruel, listing payoffs, names crossed out, and her own scrawled at the bottom like an afterthought. Found this when they burned my place, he said. The judge keeps a book of sins. Yours was in it. Her hands shook as she reached for the page, reading the words she already knew but had never seen written. Her lips trembled, torn between despair and rage. She pressed the paper to her chest like a wound. The cabin fell quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. Both of them sat in the glow of betrayal, hers from a father, his from a system that wore a mask of law. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes were different now. Not just pleading, not just broken, fierce. Then we're both ghosts, she whispered. But I'll not die swinging from his rope. The rancher finally leaned forward, his voice low, unyielding. Then you'll need to fight, and you'll need to trust me. I'll bleed later, he growled, shoving fresh cartridges into the rifle. Now, shoot. And shoot she did. The cabin became a furnace of fire and fury. Every crack in the walls spat flame. Every window was a flash of death. Men dropped screaming into the dust. Horses reared, eyes wide and white in terror. The posse faltered, but they did not break. Then the judge moved. He stepped from his horse with the slow certainty of a man convinced of his own immortality. Revolver in hand, he strode toward the cabin as if the hail of bullets was no more dangerous than a drizzle of rain. His smile never faded. Daughter, he called, voice like iron dragging across stone. You were born to swing by my rope. Do not make me wait longer. The words cut her deeper than the ropes ever had. Rage burned in her chest, but terror held her still. The rancher stumbled to the door, blood soaking his sleeve. He raised his rifle, but his hands shook, his vision blurred. The judge's revolver flared once. The rancher dropped to his knees, the rifle clattering across the dirt floor. The widow's scream split the cabin. She scrambled for the weapon, but the judge was already inside, boots grinding over the broken boards. His shadow swallowed the light. Stand, girl, he ordered, revolver aimed at her heart. "This ends with your neck in a noose." Her hands fumbled, found the dropped coil of rope lying on the floor, the same rope he had brought for her execution. She felt the hemp bite her skin. For one heartbeat, she saw herself as he wished, bound, broken, dangling at dawn, and then something changed. Her fear hardened into fire. With a cry that was half sob, half battle cry, she surged forward. The rope lashed out, catching his arm. She pulled with every ounce of strength left in her, yanking the revolver off target. The shot went wide, blowing a hole in the wall. The rancher, coughing blood, reached for his knife and dragged himself up. The widow twisted, looped the rope again and wrenched. The judge's own noose slid tight around his throat. His smile faltered at last. The struggle was brutal, close, desperate. His revolver clattered to the ground. He clawed at the rope, his boots scraping the floorboards. But the daughter he had condemned refused to let go. Dust swirled. The cabin walls shook with silence. Then, with a sudden thud, the judge collapsed to his knees. The widow stood above him. Rope in her hands, chest heaving, eyes blazing with something that was no longer fear. The rancher leaned against the wall, bloodied but alive, and whispered, "You turned it on him. You turned the rope on him." For the first time since the gallows, she smiled. Not with joy, but with release. The prairie was quiet now. The kind of silence that only follows thunder and gunfire. Smoke drifted in lazy ribbons from the shattered cabin, curling upward into the pale light of dawn. The wind carried the faint smell of gunpowder, of blood drying into the dirt, of lives spent and debts settled. The bodies of the judge's men lay scattered across the ground, their boots catching the first glints of morning sun. And there, half buried in dust and shadow, lay the judge himself. His once commanding face was slack now, eyes staring at nothing, that cruel smile